The human fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel directly into hell. Thessian space was a graveyard. Debris from destroyed orbital stations tumbled through the void like metal confetti. The planet below glowed with fires that could be seen from orbit, and surrounding it all, blocking any escape, was the Ravager fleet. Deho stood on the bridge of the Perseverance and tried not to show his shock. Intelligence reports had prepared them for a large enemy force, but nothing could have prepared them for this. There were hundreds of ships, each one massive and bristling with weapons. They moved in perfect formation like a school of mechanical sharks. "Sir," said the tactical officer, his voice tight with fear, "I'm reading 512 enemy vessels. They outmass us 400 to 1. "I can count," Deho said calmly. "All ships, this is Perseverance. Form defensive screen formation Delta 7. Prepare to engage." On the Ravager command ship, Warlord Cromath received the alert about new arrivals with mild interest. He was a massive creature built for violence with armor plating that was part of his natural body. He had commanded the Ravager Vanguard for 2 centuries and had never retreated from a battle. "What species?" he asked his sensor operator. "Humans, Warlord. 8 small vessels. Primitive design. Minimal threat." Cromath accessed the database. Humans. A young species from a high-gravity world. Recent additions to the galactic community. No significant military history with other species. He almost felt disappointed. "Destroy them quickly," he ordered, then returned to the bombardment. But the humans did not behave like any species Cromath had encountered before. When his forward ships moved to engage, expecting easy prey, the human vessels accelerated directly toward them. Not in an attack formation, not with weapons blazing. They simply charged forward at ramming speed. "They're going to collide with us," his sensor operator said in disbelief. Deliberately. At the last moment, the human ships broke formation and scattered, their weapons firing at point-blank range into the Ravager ships. It was a suicide tactic, or should have been, but the humans had calculated precisely, using their smaller size and higher acceleration to turn the Ravager formation into a disadvantage. Larger ships could not turn quickly enough. They collided with each other, trying to avoid the human vessels that danced between them like insects harassing giants. 3 Ravager ships were destroyed in the first minute. The Perseverance took heavy damage but kept fighting. Deho gripped his command chair as the ship shook from impacts. "All ships, break for atmosphere," he ordered. "Get down to the planet. We can't win up here." Lieutenant Hana flew her dropship through fire that should have destroyed her 3 times over. She was young, barely 25, with reflexes enhanced by growing up on a high-gravity world. Her ship was loaded with 40 Marines in full combat gear, and she was determined to get them down alive. "Hang on," she called to her passengers. "This is going to be rough." Rough was an understatement. She took the dropship into an atmospheric entry at an angle that every manual said would tear the ship apart. But the manuals were written by cautious people, and Hana had learned to fly by racing through asteroid fields on dares. She used Thessia's gravity to slingshot around the planet, throwing off targeting systems that expected rational flight paths. They hit ground near the Great Archives 15 minutes later. The landing was hard enough to crack the ship's frame, but everyone survived. Corporal Min Ho was the first out, his rifle already raised. He was a compact man with the solid build of someone who had spent his life in heavy gravity. Behind him, 39 other Marines spread out in defensive positions with practiced efficiency. The area around the Great Archives was in chaos. Thessian civilians ran in all directions, trying to escape the Ravager soldiers that moved through the streets. The Ravagers were efficient killers using energy weapons that left no survivors. "Rules of engagement?" asked one of Minho's Marines. "Anyone shooting at civilians is a target," Minho replied. "Light them up." The Marines opened fire. Their weapons were primitive compared to Ravager technology, using chemical propellants to launch metal projectiles, but what they lacked in sophistication, they made up for in stopping power. Ravagers fell, their armor cracking under impacts that their shields were not designed to stop. Cromath watched the planetary battle through tactical displays and felt the first stirring of uncertainty. The humans were not fighting the way species were supposed to fight. They took positions that should have been indefensible and held them through sheer aggressive determination. When they ran out of ammunition, they used explosives. When they ran out of explosives, they used their environment, collapsing buildings on Ravager positions or using urban terrain to create ambush points. How many humans are on the ground? Crometh demanded. Approximately 2,000, Warlord. And how many of our soldiers? 100,000. Crometh stared at the numbers. 2,000 humans were holding back 100,000 Ravagers. It should have been impossible. It was impossible, yet it was happening. Inside the Great Archives, Elder Pelix cowered behind an overturned desk as energy blasts tore through the ancient building. He had accepted death, made peace with it. The galaxy had abandoned his people. There would be no rescue. Then he heard new sounds. Rapid cracks of weapons fire that were different from Ravager energy weapons. Shouting in a language he did not understand. And then silence. Pelax raised his head cautiously. Standing in the doorway was a human in strange armor, holding a smoking weapon. The human's face was visible through a clear faceplate, showing a young man with hard eyes. "Are you injured?" Minho asked in badly accented Thessian. He had been practicing the language during the 3-day journey. You came," Pelax whispered. "The galaxy refused, but you came." "Yeah, well, we're not much for sitting around," Minho replied. He spoke into his communication device. "Archives are secure. Beginning evacuation of civilians. Why?" Pelax asked as Minho helped him to his feet. "Why do you sacrifice yourselves for our books? For our history?" Minho looked at the ancient being. At the tears streaming down a face that showed all 3 eyes. He thought about how to explain it and finally just shrugged. "Because when you're gone, someone should remember you existed. We're not going to let that happen." Over the next 6 hours, humanity paid a terrible price for that promise. 2 of their ships were destroyed in orbit, taking all hands with them. On the ground, Marines fought building-to-building battles against overwhelming numbers. They used tactics that no civilized species would consider. Booby traps, ambushes, fighting withdrawals that pulled Ravager forces into kill zones. Sun He worked frantically to coordinate with Thessian survivors, learning their mathematical language through pattern recognition at a speed that seemed impossible. She set up communication networks, organized evacuation routes, and translated between 2 species that were dying together. Jamin kept damaged ships flying through repairs that violated every safety regulation. When the Perseverance's reactor started failing, he crawled into radioactive spaces without proper protection to fix it manually. The exposure would probably kill him in a few years, but they needed the ship working now. By the time the first day of fighting ended, the Ravagers had been forced to stop their orbital bombardment and concentrate on the ground battle. They had never faced resistance like this. Species were supposed to break when facing impossible odds. Humans just fought harder. Cromath studied reports of the human tactics with growing respect and fear.
These creatures did not fight to win.
They fought to not lose, which was somehow more terrifying. They would hold a position until the last soldier fell, then fall back to another position and hold that. They gave ground like it cost them personally, making the Ravagers pay for every meter. In a command center beneath the archives, Deho coordinated with his surviving captains and ground forces. His face was drawn with exhaustion, but his voice remained steady. "We've bought them 6 hours," he said. 6 million Thessian civilians evacuated. That's why we came. "Sir," said his tactical officer, "Ravager reinforcements are jumping in. They're bringing their main fleet." Deho nodded slowly. The Ravagers had been surprised, caught off guard by prey that fought back. Now they were done being surprised. Now they would bring their full weight to bear. "All hands, prepare for the next wave," he ordered. "We hold this line. We don't let them through." Hana, checking her damaged dropship, heard the order and laughed without humor. Hold the line, against a force that had conquered 43 civilizations. With 8 ships, 2 of them already destroyed, and 2,000 Marines against 100,000 Ravagers, it was impossible. Everyone knew it was impossible, but they would do it anyway. That was the price of answering a call for help. That was the iron price humanity was willing to pay. Above Thessia, the Ravager main fleet began to arrive, darkening the stars with their numbers. And below, tiny human ships and desperate soldiers prepared to face them. The galaxy watched through surveillance systems and could not believe what they were seeing. The humans should have been annihilated in the first hour, yet they were still fighting, still holding, still refusing to accept the inevitable. It was illogical. It was wasteful. It was everything civilized warfare was not supposed to be. It was magnificent. 1 year after the battle for Thessia, the galaxy looked very different. New hope, The settlement for reformed Ravagers had grown from a handful of prefabricated shelters into a thriving community. Fields stretched across former wasteland, tended by beings who had once only known destruction. Children played in parks built by human engineers and Ravager craftsmen working together. Nick stood at the settlement's main plaza, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that reminded him of his lost homeworld. He was the settlement's elected representative now, speaking for those who had chosen peace over war. "Never thought I'd see this," said a voice beside him. Minho had come to observe the settlement's progress and provide additional training for the Mixed Species Defense Force. "Neither did I," Nix admitted. "A year ago I was a soldier preparing to die in battle. Now I'm a farmer learning to grow vegetables. How does it feel?" "Strange, difficult, better." On Thessia, the reconstruction was nearly complete. The great archives had been restored, with human historians working alongside Thessian scholars to recover damaged texts. Elder Pelax walked through halls that had been ruins, marveling at what had been preserved. Sun He found him there one afternoon, carefully examining an ancient manuscript. "Your people saved all of this," Pelax said without looking up. "Our entire history would have been lost." "Our people saved it together," Sun He corrected. "Humans, Thessians, even some Ravagers who switched sides. That's what made it possible." Pelax finally looked at her, his three eyes showing an emotion that took Sun He a moment to recognize. "Hope. You changed the galaxy," he said simply. The Galactic Assembly was less pleased with these changes. President He Young of Earth had been formally summoned to address the Assembly, ostensibly to receive commendations for humanity's actions. But everyone knew it was actually a trial. He Young stood in the center of the vast chamber, surrounded by representatives from hundreds of species. Many looked at her with barely concealed hostility. Humans had broken too many rules, challenged too many traditions. Council Elder Vraxon spoke first, his ancient voice carrying weight that came from millions of years of accumulated authority. "Humanity has acted recklessly. You violated protocols for military engagement. You ignored warnings from species far more experienced. You made decisions that affected the entire galactic community without consultation." "Is there a question in there?" He Young asked calmly. "You must understand that your actions cannot continue without consequences. The Assembly has certain standards. Standards like abandoning people who call for help," He Young interrupted. "Standards like turning refugees into monsters by refusing them aid? Those standards." The chamber erupted in angry voices. Speaker Theraxis called for order. "You presume too much, President. You are a young species with much to learn about galactic civilization." He Young smiled, but it was not a friendly expression. "You're absolutely right. We are young. We've only been in space for 50 years. We don't have millions of years of experience. But we learned something you seem to have forgotten. That civilization means nothing if you're not willing to protect it. You called us Deathworlders like it was an insult. You implied we were too primitive, too violent, too aggressive." She paused, looking around the chamber. "You were right about one thing. We are dangerous. We're dangerous to threats. We're dangerous to injustice. We're dangerous to the comfortable indifference that lets atrocities happen, because stopping them might be inconvenient. If that makes us unwelcome in your assembly, we'll leave. But we won't stop protecting those who need it." 83 delegations voted to censure humanity. They demanded restrictions on human military expansion, limitations on human diplomatic initiatives, oversight of human interactions with other species. 16 delegations voted against the censure. They were mostly younger species, those who had experienced their own struggles with the galactic establishment. Several had already signed mutual defense pacts with Earth. "The motion passes," Theraxis announced. "Humanity is formally censured by the Galactic Assembly. You are prohibited from—" "We're leaving," He Young said simply. The chamber fell silent. "Earth withdraws from the Galactic Assembly effective immediately. We will not be bound by the judgments of those who lack the courage to act. Any species that wishes to join us in forming a new coalition is welcome. We're calling it the Coalition of Sanctuary. Its founding principle is simple. When someone calls for help, we answer." 16 species stood and walked out with her. Others watched, uncertain, torn between ancient alliances and a new possibility. The formation of the Coalition of Sanctuary changed galactic politics overnight. It was not powerful in traditional terms. The member species were young, their technology less advanced than the elder civilizations. But they had something the assembly lacked: the willingness to act. Admiral Deho oversaw construction of the new coalition fleet. Human engineers shared their designs freely with allied species, while those species contributed their own innovations. The result was a new generation of hybrid vessels combining human durability with alien efficiency. Jae-min, recovered from his radiation exposure but permanently weakened, led the engineering teams. He worked from a wheelchair now, his body broken by the war but his mind as sharp as ever. "We're building something that's never existed before," he told his mixed species team. "Ships that represent the best of all of us. Make them count." Dr. Youngjia established the Coalition Science Institute, where researchers from different worlds worked on shared problems. Her gravitational manipulation technology, refined and improved, became the basis for new defensive systems that several species adopted. Su Jin created the Coalition Medical Academy, the first institution dedicated to treating multiple alien biologies. Human doctors learned Thessian medicine. Thessian healers studied human trauma care. Even Ravager medical knowledge focused on survival in extreme conditions found a place. The galaxy watched these developments with mixed reactions. Some species quietly approached the Coalition about membership. Others strengthened their ties to the Assembly, viewing humanity as a dangerous revolutionary force. Hana, fully recovered and now a decorated hero, trained the next generation of Coalition pilots. She taught them human tactics but also encouraged them to develop their own. Each species brought unique advantages to combat. The key was learning to combine them. "Humans are persistence predators," she explained to a class of mixed species students. "We don't give up. But Thessians have better pattern recognition. Ravagers have faster reflexes. Together we're stronger than any of us alone." Ambassador Insu became the Coalition's first Secretary of General Affairs, coordinating between member species and handling diplomatic relations. It was exhausting work, complicated by vast cultural differences and occasional conflicts. But slowly, the Coalition began to function as a real alliance rather than just a collection of treaties. Not everything was positive. Hardline Ravager factions still raided frontier worlds. Some assembly species actively worked to undermine the Coalition. Internal disputes threatened to tear apart the fragile alliance. But through it all, the core principle held: when someone called for help, the Coalition answered. It happened on a cold morning when a distress beacon reached Coalition space from the Galactic Rim. A species called the Valen were under attack by automated war machines left over from some ancient conflict. The Assembly had received the same beacon and voted not to intervene. "Too dangerous," they said. "Too far away. Not our problem." President He Young called an emergency session of the Coalition Council. Representatives from 17 species now gathered in what had been a human space station but was becoming something more. "They're calling for help," He Young said simply. "Who's coming with us?" Every species responded, "We are." The Coalition fleet launched within hours. It was not the largest fleet ever assembled, but it was the most diverse. Human ships flew alongside Thessian vessels, reformed Ravager cruisers and craft from a dozen other worlds. Deho commanded the expedition from his flagship, the new Perseverance. The old ship had been destroyed in the war, but they had built a new one, stronger and better. It carried the names of every human who had died at Thessia engraved on its hull. "All ships, this is Admiral Deho. We're jumping to Velan space in 5 minutes. We don't know what we're going to find there, but we know why we're going. Because a year ago the Thessians called for help and we answered. Because 6 months ago the Ravagers needed a chance and we gave it. Because that's who we are now." He paused, looking at the display that showed all the Coalition ships ready to jump. "We're not the strongest fleet in the galaxy. We're not the oldest or wisest. But we're the ones who show up. We're the ones who care. And sometimes that's all that matters. All ships jump on my mark." The fleet vanished into faster-than-light travel, heading toward another crisis in a galaxy that seemed full of them. Behind them, monitoring stations tracked their departure. The Galactic Assembly watched. The elder species debated. The younger ones took notes. Sunhee sat at her station preparing first contact protocols for the Valen. She thought about how far humanity had come in just 50 years. From isolated and unknown to leaders of a new coalition, from dismissed as primitive to feared and respected. 6 weeks after the battle, Thessia still bore the scars of war, but life was returning. Human and Thessian workers labored side by side to rebuild cities. Medical stations treated the wounded without asking which species they belonged to. It was in one of these stations that something unprecedented happened. Su Jin coordinated the relief effort with practiced efficiency. She had organized humanitarian missions in Earth's disaster zones before, but nothing had prepared her for this scale of destruction. Millions needed food, shelter, medical care. She worked 18-hour days and still felt like it was not enough. "Ma'am," one of her staff called out. "There's someone at the perimeter. A Ravager. Alone and unarmed." Su Jin felt her heart race. Security protocol said to detain any Ravager on site, but something in her staff's voice made her go look personally. The Ravager stood at the edge of the camp, hands raised in a gesture of surrender. It was young by Ravager standards, barely an adult. Its armor was damaged and it looked half-starved. "I seek asylum," it said in halting human language. "Please, I do not want to fight anymore." They brought the Ravager to Sunhee, who had become the de facto expert on Ravager culture and language. She sat across from the young alien in a secured room, trying to keep her hands from shaking. "This was a member of the species that had killed so many humans. What's your name?" Sunhee asked. "Nix. In your language, it means nothing. That is what I am now. My fleet is destroyed. My commander is dead. I have nowhere to go. Why come to us?" Nix's eyes, so different from human eyes yet somehow expressing the same emotions, met hers. "Because you are the only ones who showed mercy. In the battle, your medics treated captured Ravagers. Your soldiers gave water to dying enemies. We have never seen such things." Over the following days, Sunhee interviewed Nix extensively. Through these conversations, she pieced together the full tragedy of the Ravager species. Their world had died slowly over 5 centuries. They had begged for help from every civilization they encountered. Every request was denied. "We were told there was no room for refugees," Nix explained. "We were told to solve our own problems, so we did. We became strong enough to take what we needed, and killed millions in the process," Sunhee said. "Yes, we are monsters. I know this, but we are monsters the galaxy created." Sunhee brought this information to Ambassador Insu, who had arrived to help coordinate the reconstruction. Insu had also received instructions from Earth's government and a formal request to present to the Galactic Assembly. Earth proposes allocating an uninhabited but habitable world for peaceful Ravager resettlement. Insu explained to a gathering of human and Thessian officials. "We would help them rebuild. Give them a chance to become something other than conquerors." The proposal caused fierce debate. General Dong Hyun, who had arrived with the relief forces, argued strongly against it. "They're too dangerous," Dong Hyun said. "We lost thousands of people fighting them. We can't just forgive that." "We're not talking about forgiveness," Kyung-suk replied. "We're talking about breaking the cycle. If we don't help them, they'll become someone else's problem in a generation. Or they'll come back for revenge," Dong Hyun countered. "Maybe," Kyung-suk admitted. "But I'd rather take that chance than become the kind of people who could have helped and chose not to." The debate reflected divisions across all of human space. Some wanted total destruction of the remaining Ravager forces. Others wanted to try something unprecedented: rehabilitation of a hostile species. The decision was complicated when Insu took the proposal to the Galactic Assembly. He stood in the same chamber where Earth had voted alone to help the Thessians and presented his government's plan. The reaction was immediate and hostile. Speaker Theraxis, representing the Council of Elder Species, responded with barely contained anger. "You presume too much, Ambassador. The Ravagers are a galactic threat. They must be eliminated, not coddled." "With respect," Insu replied, "they became a threat because species like yours refused to help when they were victims. You created this problem. We're trying to solve it. By making the same mistake we made centuries ago? By showing mercy to those who showed none?" "No," Insu said firmly. "By being better than you. The Ravagers came to you as refugees and you turned them away. The Thessians called for help and you abandoned them. Earth is tired of cleaning up your moral failures." The chamber erupted. Species that had existed for millions of years were being lectured by humans who had barely discovered spaceflight. 83 delegations walked out in protest, but 16 stayed. 16 species, many of them younger races who remembered being dismissed by their elders, voted to support Earth's proposal. It was not enough to pass in the assembly, but it was enough to take action independently. The vote failed in the Galactic Assembly, but Earth moved forward anyway. They identified a world on the frontier, harsh but habitable. They called it New Hope and extended an offer to any Ravagers who wanted to stop fighting. The response was divided. Some Ravager factions rejected it outright, seeing it as a trap, but others, exhausted from centuries of warfare, cautiously accepted. Then the hardliners struck. A remaining Ravager battle group, refusing to accept peace, launched a final assault on Thessia. It was a suicide mission, meant to prove that Ravagers could not be redeemed. Hana was on patrol in her dropship when the attack began. She saw the Ravager ships dropping from orbit, weapons charged, heading straight for the civilian centers where millions of Thessians and humans worked on reconstruction. All units, this is Hana. I have visual on hostiles inbound. I'm intercepting. Hana, wait for support, came the response from command. No time. They'll hit the ground in 3 minutes. She pushed her dropship to maximum acceleration, climbing toward the incoming Ravager vessels. Her ship was not designed for this. It was a transport, not a fighter. But it was fast and she was determined. The calculations were simple. The Ravager flagship was too large to stop with conventional weapons. But if something impacted it at high enough speed, something with enough mass, the kinetic energy alone might be enough. Hana armed her missiles and set them to detonate around her ship, adding their explosive force to her velocity. She thought about her family back on Earth. She thought about the Thessian children she had helped evacuate. She thought about Nyx, the young Ravager trying to find a better way. This is Hana, she transmitted. Tell my mom I'm sorry I won't make it home for dinner. She slammed her dropship into the Ravager flagship at a significant fraction of light speed. The explosion lit up the sky like a second sun. The flagship disintegrated. The other Ravager ships, seeing their leader destroyed by a single insane human, broke formation and fled. Hana survived. Barely. Her ship's emergency systems had kicked in at the last second, wrapping her in protective fields that kept her alive through the impact. She spent the next month in medical care, recovering from injuries that should have killed her. The Ravager attack had failed. But it proved that not all Ravagers wanted peace. The eldest's death had fractured their leadership, creating factions that fought among themselves as much as they fought others. Slowly, carefully, Nyx helped establish communication with moderate Ravager groups. Sun He worked as translator and mediator. Together, they built the framework for the first peaceful Ravager settlement. Minho found himself training soldiers from 3 different species: humans, Thessians, and reformed Ravagers. It felt strange at first, teaching combat tactics to beings who had been enemies weeks ago, but gradually understanding developed. Why do humans fight so hard? A young Ravager trainee asked him one day. Minho thought about it. Because we're from a world that tried to kill us every day. We learned that if you want to survive, you fight. And if you fight anyway, you might as well fight for something worth protecting. Across Thessia and in human space, similar conversations were happening. Earth had proven something to the galaxy, that young species could show more wisdom than elder ones. That courage mattered more than technology. That sometimes the right choice was the hard choice, but not everyone agreed. In the Galactic Assembly, Speaker Theraxis watched humanity's growing influence with alarm. Other species were forming alliances with Earth, bypassing traditional power structures. The established order was beginning to crack. Dae-ho, promoted to admiral despite his protests, met with Kyung-suk to discuss their future. We changed something, Kyung-suk said. The galaxy will never look at us the same way. Is that good or bad? Dae-ho asked. Both, probably. We made enemies, but we also made friends. And we proved that someone has to be willing to do what's right even when it's hard. They stood looking out at Thessia from orbit, watching the lights of rebuilding cities twinkle in the darkness. Somewhere down there, humans and Thessians and reformed Ravagers were working together, building something new from the ashes of war. It was not perfect. It was not easy. But it was hope, real and tangible. And sometimes hope was enough. Admiral Kyung-suk arrived in Thessian space 3 days after the fighting began, and what she found both impressed and horrified her. The human expeditionary force had been reduced to 4 ships, all damaged. On the ground, less than 1,000 Marines still fought. They had saved 9 million Thessian civilians, but the cost had been devastating. She had brought 15 more ships and 10,000 additional troops. It still was not enough to win through conventional warfare, so they would have to try something unconventional. Captain Deho, she transmitted to the Perseverance. I'm taking overall command. Get your people ready for the most dangerous gambit you've ever seen. Deho, exhausted beyond measure, managed a grim smile. More dangerous than the last 3 days? Looking forward to it. Kyung-suk spread tactical maps across her command table. With her was Dr. Young-ja, an astrophysicist who had been working on theoretical weapons since the war began. Young-ja looked like she had not slept in weeks, and she probably had not. The asteroid field in Thessian System 4, Young-ja said, pointing to the display. Dense concentration of large bodies, unstable gravitational interactions. If we could manipulate the gravity wells using our ship's drives, we could create a collapse. Turning asteroids into weapons, Kyung-suk said. Turning space itself into a weapon, Young-ja corrected. The math says we have a 60% chance of dying in the attempt. The math doesn't know how stubborn we are. Prepare your equipment. Scout Commander Myung received his orders with the calm acceptance of someone who had expected suicide missions to be part of the job. He was lean and quick, specializing in operations behind enemy lines. His team of 12 would infiltrate the Ravager fleet using captured shuttles and gather intelligence. You're probably not coming back from this, Kyung-suk told him honestly. Probably not, Myung agreed. But if we don't go, everyone dies instead of just us. I'll take those odds. The infiltration happened during a shift change in Ravager fleet security. Myung's team had studied their patterns for days, waiting for the perfect moment. The captured shuttle approached a massive Ravager command ship, transmitting stolen identification codes. Shuttle Delta 7 requesting docking clearance, Myung said in perfectly accented Ravager language. Sun He had taught him well. Cleared for Bay 12, came the response. They were in. Moving through the Ravager ship was like walking through the belly of a living nightmare. The corridors were designed for creatures larger than humans, lit with harsh red light that hurt human eyes. Myung's team planted listening devices and hacked into computer terminals, stealing everything they could access. What they found changed everything. Admiral, Myung transmitted back to Kyung-suk, using a tight beam that could not be intercepted. You need to see this. The Ravagers, they're not conquerors by choice. The data painted a tragic picture. The Ravagers had once been a peaceful species living on a world that died slowly. Ecological collapse had made their planet uninhabitable over the course of generations. They had begged the galactic community for help, for resettlement, for any kind of aid. Every request had been denied. Resources were scarce, they were told. Immigration was complicated. Perhaps in a few more centuries. Their world had not had a few more centuries. So they had built ships with the last of their resources and taken what they needed by force. After the first conquest, there was no going back. The galaxy had declared them monsters, so they became monsters because monsters at least survived. They're us, Sun He said when she saw the data, or they're what we could have become if Earth had died and the galaxy looked away. The eldest, leader of the Ravager fleet, received reports of human infiltration with cold calculation. The humans continued to surprise him, continued to adapt, but adaptation would not save them from overwhelming numbers. He opened a communication channel directly to Kyung-suk's flagship. Human Admiral, his voice rumbled through the speakers. We have studied your tactics. We have learned from your resistance. You fight well for such a young species, but you cannot win. We are what survival made us. Given time, you will become us. Kyung-suk looked at the image of the eldest on her screen. She saw the scars, the exhaustion, the desperate hunger that drove him. Maybe, she replied, but not today. Today we're going to show you what happens when you meet prey that bites back. The human fleet moved toward the asteroid field, broadcasting their movements openly. It looked like a retreat, like they were trying to lose themselves in the rocks. The Ravagers followed eagerly, seeing a chance to end this frustrating battle. All ships to position, Kyung-suk ordered. Her voice was steady despite the fear she felt. Engineering teams prepare gravitational pulse generators. This has to be perfectly timed. The human ships spread out through the asteroid field, taking positions that seemed random but were calculated to within a fraction of a degree. The Ravagers followed, their formation breaking apart as they navigated between massive rocks. Now, Kyung-suk said. Young-ja activated her equipment. The human ships released synchronized gravitational pulses, invisible waves of force that rippled through space itself. The asteroids began to move slowly at first, then faster. Gravitational interactions that had been stable for millions of years suddenly became catastrophic. On the Ravager ships, alarms screamed as asteroids the size of mountains began to converge on their positions. They tried to retreat but found themselves trapped. The asteroids moved in patterns that blocked every escape route, guided by human calculations and inhuman precision. All ships, weapons free, Kyung-suk ordered. Hit them while they're trapped. The human fleet opened fire. Their weapons were less powerful than Ravager technology, but they did not need to be. The Ravagers were pinned, unable to maneuver, caught between human weapons and moving mountains of rock. The battle was chaos. Asteroids collided with ships. Ships collided with each other. The carefully ordered Ravager formation became a disaster zone, and through it all, human ships moved with desperate speed, firing until their weapons overheated, then firing more. The Perseverance took 3 direct hits that should have destroyed it. Jamin somehow kept the ship running, channeling power from life support to weapons, from weapons to engines, from engines back to life support, in a rotation that should have been impossible. He worked with burned hands and radiation sickness, refusing to leave his post. Just a bit more, he muttered to the ship as if it could hear him. Just stay together a bit more. Hana flew her dropship through the chaos, evacuating crews from damaged vessels. She made runs that violated every rule of safe flying, pulling survivors from ships seconds before they exploded. Her co-pilot stopped counting close calls after the 15th one. On the ground, Minho and his remaining Marines prepared for what they assumed would be their last stand. If the space battle failed, the Ravagers would bombard the planet until nothing lived. "It's been an honor," one of his Marines said. "It's not over yet," Minho replied, though he did not believe it himself. Then the Ravagers retreated. Broken, scattered, their fleet in ruins, they jumped to faster than light and fled. Of the 500 ships that had entered the asteroid field, less than 200 escaped. The eldest's command ship was one of the casualties. He died when an asteroid the size of a city crushed his vessel like an insect. His last transmission was simply, "How?" Kyung-suk stood on her damaged bridge and tried to comprehend what had happened. They had won. Against impossible odds, with tactics that had never been tried, they had actually won. Then she looked at the casualty reports and felt sick. 11 of her ships were destroyed. Thousands of her people were dead. The survivors were injured, traumatized, pushed beyond what any person should have to endure. "Admiral," her communication officer said quietly, "we're receiving transmissions from across the galaxy. Everyone watched the battle. They want to know how we did it." "Tell them the truth," Kyung-suk said. "We did it because we had to. Because someone had to. Because if not us, then who?" Mayong and 3 members of his team made it back to the human fleet. The others died when their shuttle was destroyed, escaping the Ravager ship. He delivered his intelligence data to Kyung-suk personally. "They were refugees," he said. "Just people trying to survive." "People who killed millions," Kyung-suk replied. "Yes, both things are true." Sun-hee worked with Thessian scholars to translate the captured Ravager data. She cried when she read their original distress calls from centuries ago, the desperate pleas that went unanswered. They had been just like the Thessians. The galaxy had failed them too. The human fleet regrouped in orbit over Thessia. They had saved the Thessians. They had defeated the Ravagers. But the cost had been enormous and the victory felt hollow. Daeho visited the medical bay where Jamin lay dying from radiation exposure. The engineer smiled weakly. "We made it," Jamin said. "You made it possible," Daeho replied. "The ship should have died a dozen times. Ships are easy. They just need someone who refuses to let them quit. Like us." Young Jaw's calculations had been right. 60% chance of death. They had beaten the odds, but just barely. As the surviving humans began damage control and tried to process what they had endured, a new transmission came from Galactic Assembly Space. Hundreds of species wanted to know Earth's secret. The emergency beacon cut through the darkness of space like a scream. It traveled faster than light itself, carrying a message that would reach 247 civilized worlds within hours. The message was simple and desperate. The Thessian collective was dying and they needed help. On the planet Thessia, fires burned across 3 continents. The sky glowed orange with destruction as massive ships hung overhead like predators circling wounded prey. These were the vessels of the Ravager fleet, an armada that had conquered 43 civilizations over 8 centuries. They had perfected the art of destruction, and now they had come for the Thessians. The Thessians were scholars and artists, philosophers and dreamers. They had built a civilization that valued knowledge above all else. Their libraries held information spanning 12 star systems and 10,000 years of history. But knowledge could not stop the plasma cannons that rained down from orbit. Philosophy could not shield their children from the invasion forces that swept through their cities. Elder historian Pelax stood in the great archives as the building shook from nearby explosions. He was old, even by Thessian standards, and his 3 eyes had witnessed the best of his people's achievements. Now those same eyes watched as everything burned. He had sent the distress beacon himself, using the last of the planetary communication array's power. Surely someone would come. Surely the galaxy would not let them die alone. 10,000 light-years away on a space station called Harmony's End, the Galactic Assembly convened an emergency session. Representatives from hundreds of species gathered in the vast circular chamber, their forms as varied as the stars themselves. Some floated in tanks of liquid. Others stood on multiple legs or hovered using technology beyond easy understanding. They all shared one thing in common. They had received the Thessian plea, and they were about to refuse it. Ambassador Insu of Earth stood in the human delegation section, listening as one species after another explained why they could not help. The reasons varied, but the outcome was always the same. The Ravagers were too strong. The Ravagers were too experienced. The Ravagers had never been defeated. To oppose them was to invite destruction. The Thessian situation is tragic, said Council Elder Vraxen, a being so ancient that its species had achieved spaceflight before humans had discovered fire. But we must think of our own people. The Ravager fleet is too dangerous. Any species that opposes them will be marked for extermination. We cannot risk it. The chamber filled with agreement. Hundreds of voices speaking in dozens of languages, all saying the same thing. No, they would not help. They would not risk themselves. The Thessians would have to face their fate alone. Insu felt something hot and angry build in his chest. He had been Earth's representative for 5 years now, and in that time he had learned that humans were considered young and foolish by galactic standards. Earth had only made contact with alien life 50 years ago. 50 years was nothing to species that measured their histories in millions. But Insu had also learned that age did not always bring wisdom. He activated his speaking platform without waiting for permission. The gesture was considered rude, but Insu no longer cared about their rules. Earth votes to intervene, he said simply. The chamber fell silent. Then laughter began. It started as a ripple and grew into a wave. The elder species found it hilarious that these newcomers, these children barely out of their cradle world, thought they could succeed where others would not even try. Ambassador Insu, Vraxen said with what might have been pity, your species is brave but ignorant. You have been part of galactic civilization for barely a moment. You know nothing of real warfare on this scale. If you oppose the Ravagers, humanity will be destroyed. Maybe, Insu replied, but at least we'll be able to look at ourselves afterward. The vote was called. 247 species had received the Thessian beacon. Only one voted to respond. Earth stood alone. The news reached Earth 3 hours later. The United Government spent 72 hours in heated debate. Some argued that Earth could not afford to make enemies of the Ravager fleet. Others pointed out that Earth had nothing the Ravagers wanted, and everything to prove to the galaxy. But the deciding argument came from an old general who had fought in Earth's last major war. If we don't go, she said, then what's the point of having ships at all? We built them to protect people. The Thessians are people. It's that simple. The vote passed. Earth would respond. Captain Deho stood on the bridge of the Earth defense vessel Perseverance when the orders came through. He was a broad-shouldered man with gray hair and eyes that had seen too much combat. Around him, his crew worked at their stations with practiced efficiency. They all knew what was coming. Attention all hands, Deho said into the ship-wide communication system. We've received our orders. We're going to Thessian space. The Ravager fleet is there and they're killing millions. The rest of the galaxy has decided to look the other way. But that's not who we are. He paused, knowing his next words would be recorded, studied, and possibly played at memorial services. They say we're too young to understand what we're facing. They say we don't know enough about galactic warfare. They're probably right. But maybe that's exactly why we're the only ones stupid enough to care. The Thessians called for help. We're going to answer. All ships prepare for jump. Sun He, the ship's xenolinguist, stood at her station running through Thessian language databases. She was young for her position, brilliant and dedicated. She had spent her whole life preparing for first contact situations, but never like this. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked. Nervous? Asked Jae-min, the chief engineer. He was a stocky man with permanent grease stains on his uniform and a talent for keeping impossible machines running. Terrified, Sun He admitted. The Ravagers have never lost. Not once in 800 years. Then they're due for a surprise, Jae-min said with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. The Perseverance joined with 7 other Earth vessels. It was a tiny fleet by galactic standards. The ships were small, their weapons less advanced than those of the elder species. But they were crewed by humans, and humans had one advantage that no one in the galaxy had properly understood yet. Humans came from Earth, a death world where almost everything had tried to kill them for millions of years. They had evolved as persistence predators, creatures that hunted by simply refusing to give up. They had survived ice ages and plagues, wars and disasters. They had learned to adapt to anything, to keep fighting when every logical species would have surrendered. The galaxy was about to learn what that really meant. As the 8 ships jumped into faster-than-light travel, heading toward a war zone that terrified the most powerful civilizations in known space, Daeho looked out at the stars and thought about the Thessians who were dying while waiting for help that only Earth was willing to give. 3 days until we arrive, he said quietly. 3 days until we find out if courage is enough. Behind him, his crew worked in silence. They all knew the odds. They all knew they were probably flying toward their deaths. But not one of them questioned the mission. Some things were worth dying for. Some lines could not be crossed without response, and some calls for help could not go unanswered no matter the cost. The Perseverance and her sister ships raced through the void, carrying Earth's answer to the galaxy's cowardice. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and racing toward an enemy that had never known defeat, but they were coming anyway. That was what made them human.